We're here this morning with Steve Raby, who is President of Direct Communications, and want to talk a little this morning about his former employer and a great statesman here in Alabama, Senator Howell Heflin. Steve, thank you for being with us this morning. Wanted to ask you your impressions of not only Senator Heflin's impact on the state of Alabama by his accomplishments, but you have mentioned that that his own background enabled him to do great things for the state of Alabama. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, first, I appreciate the opportunity to be included on this project. I think Senator Heflin had a huge impact locally here in the state and certainly in Washington as well. But and I should say, to give you a little bit of background, I was blessed. I served on him on campaign staff, legislative staff, and his chief of staff. But we came home the same time in '97, and so I really had the opportunity from '97 until his death that we talked quite frequently, several times a week, and to reflect on his work and his life, and that was a great joy. As we were talking earlier, I think to understand a little bit about where Howell Heflin came from, both personally and from his family's history standpoint, Senator Heflin had two generations before him in the United States Congress. And one of those generations was during the middle of the Civil War. And he didn't talk about his great uncle, who was a congressman, a Republican congressman, but he certainly had some impact on the way he saw the world. His uncle, Cotton Tom Heflin, from East Alabama, was a United States Senator and was known at the time to be very active in the Ku Klux Klan and a lot of racial issues and other issues. In fact, he was not allowed to, as a sitting U.S. Senator, qualify as a Democrat to hold his own seat because he would not support Al Smith, the Democratic nominee, who happened to be a Catholic. And so that was the purpose that Senator Tom Heflin was really lost his seat in the United States Senate. So Heflin had that observation on the politics of racial divide, religious divide. Not that he appreciated the way the senator did that, but he was certainly proud of his service and some of the things that he was doing for rural Alabama and trying to help the rural community, the farm community. Senator Tom Heflin was very much a populist in that regard. It was just a different generation. So, and Senator Cotton Tom's Heflin brother, Marvin Heflin, which was Senator Heflin, or Judge Heflin's father, was a minister. He was a Methodist minister, and they traveled all over the state growing up. And in fact, Senator Heflin was born in Georgia because Reverend Heflin had a church in Poland, Georgia. And of course, as a politician, he is often asked about that. They try to make an issue that you weren't even born here. And Judge Heflin's response was that his father was doing missionary work amongst the heathen when he was born. So, but growing up in rural Alabama at these churches, he had the opportunity to see people in their Sunday best, but also in the rural areas and the poverty and the opportunities that were lacking at that time. And so that forged a lot of the way he thought about people and policy and how you should approach things. And I will do one quick recollection. Because of moving around, Senator Heflin was very unusual. In high school, he was in Etowah County, and during that time, the Methodist pastors were moved in the fall, and he was playing football. I think it was Etowah County Blue Devils, and before the cotton picking break, and when they moved to Colbert County after the break, they saw that he was a big boy and asked him, did he play football? And he in fact did, and so he started playing football for Leeton at the time, and it was unusual. He actually lettered in high school that year at 2 different schools because he had played enough. So that was a little signal of his life moving around the way he did to different communities. I just think those things are important. We all are forged by what we witness and observe as young people, and I certainly saw the impact on what he did both as lawyer and judge and U.S. Senator.
Talk a little bit, if you will, about his early days as a lawyer from what you have been told, but also some about the work and the networking that it required to enable the state to reach the amendment of the Constitution to the judicial article.
Okay. The problem is trying to limit my comments and be succinct in them. Judge Heflin had attended college at Birmingham Southern, and that was really not a choice because he could go there as a Methodist college and being the son of a Methodist minister. So that decision was made for him. But he left Birmingham Southern after graduating and joined the Marines and was actually in active combat in the Pacific. And so, you know, that forges, it didn't forge him, it forged an entire generation in the way he approached things. So a lot of those guys, and he was one of them, the judge was one of them, that didn't approach anything in a fearful standpoint. It's, it's a hill to be taken and let's go get it. And so that applied to his life both as a lawyer, as an individual, and as a politician. Being a GI gave him the opportunity to go to law school. He wanted to be a lawyer, and he loved being a lawyer. And he was a real lawyer in that he practiced law, and he had civil cases, he had criminal cases. And in those days, you couldn't actually just make a living on it. And so as a young lawyer, once he left Tuscaloosa, Alabama Law School, he went to Tuscumbia for a lot of reasons, most of which at that point Elizabeth Ann Carmichael was there, and he was in hot pursuit of her, that he wanted her and wanted her to be his wife. Moving to Tuscumbia as a new lawyer, he had to take another job, and the job was the executive director of the Tuscumbia Housing Authority. It was interesting that him looking at the purpose of the housing authority, looking at the community, he made a decision very early on as they started the projects of building these housing projects that it was not going to be one project at that time, and this was the early 50s, that it would be 2 projects, one in the white community and one in the black community. And that was not just an easy decision to make, especially as someone that was recently hired and wanting to keep that job. Another comment that we had discussed earlier, that his very first case, he defended the black man for murder. And to try to gain a reputation as a lawyer in the business community and as a future politician, that was really not the thing to do. But again, it was the mentality that he had, that there's the hill and let's go take it, and he wasn't fearful of it. As a lawyer, he was, I think I'd mentioned that he was a real lawyer. One week he'd be defending a criminal, the next week, someone accused of criminal activity. The next week he would be representing a plaintiff in some type of personal injury trial. The next week he'd be representing the insurance company, defending the insurance company as a plaintiff. And so it was an interesting observation he had of people and experiences as a lawyer. One of the important things that he recognized early, he didn't just practice in one county, he had practiced around North Alabama and West Alabama. And his observations early on was it was not a matter of knowing the law. He could try a very similar case one week in Lawrence County and the next week be in Shelby County or Tuscaloosa County and find out that you had to try it completely different, not because of the law, but because of the court. And each court had its own set of rules, and administered by the presiding judges and the other politicians in the courthouse. And that was an item of discussion among a lot of young lawyers at that time that were practicing law, and it planted the seed of what do we need to do? Is this the best thing that that the state has to offer in terms of people finding justice? And it sparked an effort on the part of a lot of, I say, young attorneys. They were young. A lot of them were older because they had military service and were late going to law school. And but they saw some problems that they had to face. One which is not often mentioned, Alabama was known as or certain counties were known as a quickie divorce place, and people would come in here from around the southeast to get a quickie divorce. And is that the image you want of the state? You know, is that what you want the courts used for? Certainly there was a lot of racial strife and racism, I should say. And I think that generation saw that that was a charge that was before them, and they had to pick up. Judge Heflin was often given credit for being a leader, and he was, but he was really part of a group of lawyers, judges, some politicians, some business people that wanted to try to change the state piece by piece. He was elected as president of the Trial Lawyers Association, and I think the following year or 2 years later as president of the Bar Association. And in both of those leadership positions, he took that as a way to communicate, and let's find a way as lawyers to deal with the Ku Klux Klan. How do you break down the Ku Klux Klan? Do you break it down financially? Do you break it down politically? Do you break it down? But certainly in the court of law, we should be able to break it down. So that was a big part of what that group of people were doing. And the core concern that always was a part of this conversation is that the issue itself is hard enough, but the courts are set up in such a way that it's even more difficult. We may achieve this in 4 counties. We can't achieve it in the other 7, and certainly not in all 67. So there was more discussion going on by this group at that time. What do we need to do to unify our court system? And the simple question was, it can't happen with the 1901 Constitution. And so the effort was underway. Let's take the entire article of the Constitution and find a way to modernize our courts so that we make it a little immune to politics, and whatever the law is in Cleveland County, it should be the law in Houston County or Madison County. And at that time, and this was in the late 60s, this group had to decide, okay, it's a great effort. How do we put that together, and who's holding us back? And At that time, the Supreme Court was one of those roadblocks. And so the effort was made and put together by this team of people from all 67 counties to run a candidate, and they chose Howell Heflin to run as Chief Justice. This campaign was both a campaign of the politician and about this election, but from day one it was about constitutional reform. So as soon as he was sworn in, the effort was underway for a new judicial article, and it wasn't just a Montgomery effort. It was an effort all over the state. Local judges that were willing to do something about it put together the public relations to communicate and educate the public, locally at the newspapers, civic clubs. So Judge Heflin at that time was all over the state speaking about this and what we needed to do to modify. And it's just taken for granted, even by lawyers at this time, that we've got this system of a district court, circuit court, a court of general jurisdiction, and you peel it out. These issues go to the Civil Court of Appeals, Criminal Court of Appeals, and then ultimately the Supreme Court if necessary. None of that existed. You know, conceptually, it was not here. All of these issues could be determined in the county courthouse. A speeding ticket, a 50-mile-an-hour speeding ticket, could be $12 in one county. It could be $200 in another. A court fine could be the same way. So it was not just amending the Constitution, it was amending the way things were done in my county, and been done this way forever. So I don't think, you know, I could do justice if I talked about it for 2 hours. The task that this group undertook to give us a court system that was streamlined and again, amending the Constitution to accomplish that was a huge task.
You have mentioned that although Judge Heflin has been given credit for the judicial article, and I've always heard that it took a massive team effort, and that he really wanted it to be that way.
Yes, it was always about the effort and not him. And we'll talk about a few of the folks, but Judge Heflin at the time would either be the good cop or the bad cop in whatever community or county he needed to be. Where in those counties where he had elected officials that were willing to be part of this Constitution reform, Heflin would come into that community being the bad guy and almost talking to extremes as to what we needed to do, simply to set up so the local judges, probate judges, court judges, or commissioners or clerks could move their legislators. Look, if y'all will just get us to this point, we don't care about what Heflin's talking about, but if you can just give us 1, 7, and 8. And so in other counties where he would have to take on the establishment, he would come in and he would try to be the good cop, and other local people would demonize the local court, local judges, local legislators. So this was a huge team effort, and we're blessed that a lot of those people that were involved are still with us. At that point, State Senator Bo Torbert was very active and was the, I was going to say heir apparent. They wouldn't think of it that way, but he was the person to bring in, understanding this. He was a legislative leader, he was a lawyer, and he was the obvious person to take the helm of the Supreme Court to be the leader of the implementation legislation. It's great to change the Constitution, but you've got to have legislation.
Why didn't Judge Heflin want to keep it another term?
If the judge were still around, I would say that it was time for him to move to another level of service. But you know, and we all have to consider the practical parts of it. But at that time, the late '60s, lawyer Heflin was making more than $250,000 a year, which is a lot of money at that time. And he went from this level of income going in to less than $20,000 as being Chief Justice. And so that certainly had an impact on his family, what he wanted to do. But Judge Heflin truly was a man of integrity, and he was not about to stay on the Supreme Court, being seen as a leader to bring judicial article and judicial reform. And part of the compromise was to get salaries of judges and retirement for judges at a level that was consistent with you know, income from your law practice and the retirement. And so at the time it was seen as lucrative, and he was not going to change the law, be sitting there and be the recipient of the new salary of the Chief Justice. So it was important for him to show that this was not about me, and he stepped away and continued to stay involved through the Bar Association, through the Trial Lawyers Association, and through his impact in other politics. And he was looking at a political future more towards Washington than Montgomery, and had a good idea that Senator John Sparkman at that time would be retiring in 1978, and so he started laying the groundwork for his Senate race as well. But those 3 or 4 factors was a major impact on his decision not to stay there.
If you had to make a short list of accomplishments of his career in Washington, what would your memories list?
He, you know, there's been books written about this, but I think from a conceptual standpoint, he was very proud of. Number one, he was a member of the Judiciary Committee, and he had a standing when he arrived in Washington as understanding how to streamline and reform a court. I mean, the National Association had given him awards for it. Network televisions had honored him as Man of the Year for these changes, and so he came in with a reputation of understanding not just the law but the court system. And for the 3 terms that he was there, that was always a big focus. What changes do we need to make with the federal court system? What type of relationship do we need to build between the federal and the state courts? And some of the arcane notions of bankruptcy. You know, and he would wade into issues on Judiciary Committee that were probably the most politically contested. Really, all of his political problems, every politician has one, but all of them had their genesis on his service on the Judiciary Committee. He thought it was important that African Americans be appointed to the federal judiciary, and certainly in the South. In early service, we had 2 appointed. He always thought that was important. Some of the judicial nominations that came up, we were getting into the television age, and so you know, Judge Bork and a lot of those that were appointed to the Supreme Court, he was hell-bent on getting to the truth and what type of judge it would be, instead of a philosophy of conservative liberal activism. And he certainly had a lot of impact there. Personally, he's very proud of his service on the Ag Committee, and it sounds like just for farmers, and a lot of it was, but there was a huge rural development component, which has brought a lot of changes to Alabama and the South. He was very proud of his service there. He was also very proud of being part of rebuilding our military. We had been envisioned from the world standpoint that we were cutting back on spending and we were a weaker military and we could not, number one, defend ourselves from the new technology of the missile attacks and so forth. And so he was very active there. But I would say those were probably his greatest accomplishments, in my words. What he would say is he was proud of being involved with making some of those changes from a federal perspective.
Okay. Because I think this is also going to be used to demonstrate to those who are involved in revamping the Lawyers Hall of Fame, how this is going to progress. Let's talk a little bit about other people you perceive could weigh in not only on perhaps Senator Heflin, but Judge Torbert, and see if we can't talk just a little bit about how we could meld some of those people's thoughts into having something that'd be real meaningful in Montgomery.
I think it would be meaningful at different levels, not only of, we should never forget our past and just assume things happen. But in the 21st century, one of the 5 issues of discussion about a governor's race, a Senate race, or anything in Alabama is constitutional reform. And the fact that it was accomplished, a big portion of it, we need to, number one, take note that it happened, and then ask ourselves, how did it happen, and what did this group do? And we're blessed to have people that were involved, and some of them are not lawyers, but Judge Torbert was, then State Senator Torbert, was very active from a political standpoint, from a public relations standpoint, from education, communicating, talking to other legislators and judges in all 67 counties. But when the time came for heavy lifting, he was one of the leaders there in the state Senate. Another individual still around is Ronnie Flippo, who was served as a congressman but also served in the state Senate. He was one of the leaders. And he was an accountant. But to get people like that involved from the business community and other elected legislators. Bob Hill, an attorney from Florence, was in the legislature, and he was very, very active. And so we've got a wealth of information that we really need to draw upon of people, of attorneys and other folks who were not involved, or were involved but were not lawyers, that we need to hear their story, and we need to hear their story about the movement at the time. We need to hear their story that they saw roadblocks and didn't waver because of it, but decided a strategy must be put together, how we get around it, how do we go over it. And one thing I didn't mention, one of those roadblocks at the time was Governor Wallace, and it was not, that's never a easy task in Alabama to battle with Governor Wallace. So I would, it is my hope that that y'all would have the opportunity to visit with these people and record much of this, because they are responsible for us having a court system that at the time truly was an envy. And I ought to mention, even in, I don't remember the exact time, but the last year he was there in the U.S. Senate, Judge Heflin was still getting requests for appointments from chief justices and justices of state courts all across the country to come in and talk to him. And the meetings were all similar. that, Judge, this is what we're doing. This is what our state constitution allows. This is what we're trying to get to. And just to seek his advice. And, you know, this was 25 years after serving as chief judge. But so a lot of people assumed it was always about federal legislation that they were coming in, but it never was. You know, occasionally one or two.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is we might take a lesson from the effort that was made to change the judicial article. And if we really desire constitutional reform, we might learn from those who have accomplished that.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of people that's still here and still involved in some way. But you know, that it's not unusual. Just generation to generation, we assume things happen. But this was a concerted effort. It wasn't our state's founding fathers that put together this concept. We had to fight our founding fathers from day one. So it is doable. It can be done. And it requires a lot of hard work, a lot of people, a lot of organization, and financial resources. But above all, it requires committed people to make it happen. And to say that we've tried and failed, you know, that just was not part of this group's mantra. They were going forward. Going forward.
I thank you.